To introduce myself, my name's Ferrie. I'm a crop consultant. My family and I own a crop consulting business in central Illinois. Long, boring state to drive through. We're about right in the middle. So we're just south of Bloomington, Illinois. What keeps the lights on in our business, pays the bills, is soil testing. So we soil test hundreds of thousands of acres each year, and we do the fertility recommendations. We help with BRTing all the nutrients from nitrogen all the way to population and multi-hybrids, that type of thing. And at the end of the year, we sit down and go through thousands of acres of yield maps, which is a unique part of our business because I write the prescription for what we want for fertility, and then I get to see the yield map at the end to know what's working and what's not working. And something that we've been doing this for 40 years, so we've been at it a while. So what amazes me always when we're doing yield maps in the fall is in the morning, a guy will be in there, we'll be going through his yield maps, and he's excited about 220, 230, 40 bushel corn. Everything's working for him. In the afternoon, his neighbor will come in, and he's in the 270, 280, 290 range. And these guys have an imaginary property line between them that separates them, and realizing they're operating at total different levels. And in my business, you'd like to take the 280 bushel yield map and show it to the 240 and say, we're leaving a lot of money on the table. We can't do that, or you get fired in a hurry if you were sharing some data, but we get to see it every year. I mean, it's amazing. And then we get to sort through what's working, what's not. And part of our business is soil testing and doing all that work. The other part is consulting. So we do about 150 field trials a year looking at everything from fungicides to you name it, and bring that data back to our customer base, because when we have a very productive farm, it's always fertile, but fertile farms are not always productive. So what's that difference in between there, and bring it back. Now, my commitment to our customers is we don't sell anything. We don't collect any commissions for all the work that we're doing in the research side. So we can talk about planters and fungicides and that type of thing without there being a bias tied to it. How do you finance that? As a company, we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in that side of the business. Part of it is financed by our customer base, and then we do things like the Corn College events and events at our training center, and we speak all over the United States and Canada as well. So by Superior Ag hiring me to speak to you today, and you supporting them so they could hire me, you're supporting my habit, and I appreciate that. It's a situation where, but I always say follow the money, and that's the story here today. We don't sell fertilizer, but we're going to talk about fertilizer. Now, as a soil testing company, we're looking at all these yield maps, and I'd love to tell you that what affects yield the most. I'd love to tell you soil testing and fertility is like number 1. Unfortunately, it's not. It's like number 13, okay? There's 2 things that separate yield from one farm to the next that are way ahead of everything else, and the number 1 is water management. You think water management, is that irrigation? Is that tile? Is that surface drainage? Yep. Is it compaction? Vertical root systems? Hybrid leaf structure? They all, hybrid population, that all fits into water management. Number 2, right behind that, is hybrid selection when it comes to corn. How well you did at selecting a hybrid that fits your farm and your management style. And then soil fertility is down the list. But it's an important foundation piece that needs to be there. We can't take a farm that's in trouble and make it as productive as a neighbor who's got good fertility. So we kind of start with some math first, so we kind of get on the same page. And we look at a soil test. There's maybe too much read into a soil test. So a soil test is an indicator to tell me what your nutrient availability is going to be like during the growing season. But it's not rocket science. It's more like a tugboat pushing a barge down the river, right? They're not going to make any quick turns. Or like showing a pig. If you ever showed a pig at the fair, what do, right? You want to go that way, you whack it on this side a couple times. And if it want to go this way, you whack it on that side. If it doesn't move, you whack it harder, right? That's kind of how soil testing is. You got 2 million pounds of living earth out here that's doing its own thing, and you're trying to steer this aircraft carrier, it's not a jet ski or a speedboat, in the right direction so you can maintain the yields that you want. We think about uptake. We put phosphate on this farm in the fall, and we say how much phosphorus ends up in that plant. The total phosphorus uptake in that plant, if we were to do a carbon-15 tracer with it, you're going to be lucky if 30% of the phosphorus in that plant came from what you applied last fall. So where does the other 70% go? You say, well, it goes in the river and kills the fish. No, it goes into the biology. So the biology in your soil, the microbes in your soil, they're the ones that supply the big chunk of the food you need. If you could get to 50% of your nitrogen that you applied in that plant, of its needs, you'd be very efficient. And we can change that with our 4Rs, but where does the rest of the N come from? So I put 240 pounds of N on you, you're saying maybe 100, 110 got in the crop. Where'd the rest go? And then we could say, well, it went in the air, went in the river, went in the stream. No, it went into the biology. You got to feed the soil. There's no way to feed this soil or put nitrogen on this soil without the microbes responding to it. And when they respond, they make nutrients available. So it's a process of cycling. So when we test your soil for fertility, we may see 25 parts per million of phosphorus in a Bray test. That is not the total phosphorus in there. It's probably somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 pounds of phosphate in your soil. But when we try to see how much will become available at a certain amount of time, that's what the soil test is about. So we're going to check it and see. So 25 parts per million gives us an optimum range. What does optimum means? That means that during the growing season, you're going to get somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 parts per million of ortho, water-soluble phosphorus. So 1.5 to 3.5 parts per million. We can grow all the 300 bushel corn we want and 100 bushel beans in that range. Okay? So what do I mean by ortho? If we took your soil and we put it in a canister with a screen on the bottom, we poured distilled water in the top, eventually water come out the bottom, you test the water, there's phosphate in it. That's the phosphate the crop uses, that's the phosphate that the microbes use. Phosphate availability in your soil is probably 90% driven by biology. So the soil test doesn't mean much if your soil temperatures aren't above 65 degrees. So when the soil temperature gets above 65, the microbes light up and they start their process of mineralizing past crops forward. And the population doubles every 10 degrees. From 50 to 65, you can grow a lot of corn, but you can't get nutrients out of the soil very well. So even if you had a high testing soil, if you plant the corn, it gets up and the temperatures lock up on you, you're going to have purple corn. 48 hours after it warms up, the purple corn is going to turn back green. Okay? That's how fast the biology works in the soil. So why don't we test for ortho-P? Why do we use the Bray, the Olsen, the Malick? Why do we use all these different tests? Why don't we test for ortho? Because that's what we're trying to predict. Well, the problem with orthophosphate, it changes on the hour. So if you were looking at orthophosphate in the morning, it would change by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, all driven by temperature and moisture and the activity that's taking place out there. Trying to take a soil test, run ortho, and predict 2 years' worth of fertilizer needs would be a problem. Okay? So we know from doing a lot of testing as well as looking at a lot of research, for most part on a Bray sample, I need to be somewhere around 25 parts per million to hit this consistently, but we won't hit it until we're above 65 degrees. Okay? So we think about how you'd manage that gap. If you're pushing corn early, starter fertilizer would be one way to do it, because starter fertilizer isn't tied to temperature. If the root gets to it, it's going to pick it up in that case. We've done a lot of work ourselves. This is from Iowa State, looking at what, if we have average corn price, that's probably going to change, right? Average corn price and average fertilizer prices, where is the payback? Where's the ROI I'm putting fertilizer on out here in the field? So looking at a Bray test, their data says somewhere between 18 to 25 parts per million on the Bray test, there's a 25% chance that you're going to have a return on investment. Potash, around 171 to 220 parts per million. As we drop from that, so 10 to 17, there's a 55% chance you're going to have a return on investment. But if we get up here at 35 or 40 parts per million, and you're putting fertilizer on and you're expecting a change in the ROI for the next crop, that's probably not going to happen, right? So it's a range that we're in as far as availability itself goes. Now, we need to clarify some numbers as far as nutrient removal and nutrient uptake. So at Crop Tech, we do a bunch of hybrid plots and with our growers, and we look at plant characteristics. So we look at the plant height, leaf structure, is it upright, is it pendulum, wide leaf, narrow leaf. We look at all those to help us manage water. And then we look at the ear. Does it flex in girth easy? Does it flex in length? And if it flexes in length, does it happen before tassel or after tassel? And does it flex in depth of kernel, which that's what's happening right here. The last 30 days of grain fill, how deep can the kernel get? So in order to understand that, we have to harvest thousands of ears. I think somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 ears get harvested, weighed. Every kernel is counted, shelled, then reweighed, so we know the cob weight, the grain weight, the test weight, the moisture, and then we take samples and we ship them off to see what the nutrients in the corn is. So we know exactly what population is planted at and what yield it actually yielded, and how does yield and population change nutrient uptake in the plant. So this data comes from our set, but we would tell you, based on thousands of samples, for a bushel of corn in Illinois anyway, 0.34 pounds of P2O5 per bushel and 0.23 pounds of K2O per bushel. So if we look at that and we realize that we're going to grow 250 bushel corn, we're going to say removal rate, what goes in the truck and leaves your farm, about 187 pounds of DAP, about 95 pounds of potash. Okay? That's what's leaving the field in that process. Now, is that it? Do we only have to worry about removal? No, we got to worry about uptake. Okay? So uptake, how much does it take to grow this crop, is got to be something we keep our eye on. So for nitrogen, we talk a lot of times, guys talk about a pound of N per bushel, 1.2, 0.7, 0.8. We can all have this discussion in here what we're raising our corn on. But if you account for all the N that's in the plant and the root system, and we do this by growing corn hydroponically, but situation, what is all the N in there? It takes 1.6 pounds of N. So it takes 1.6 pounds of nitrogen to grow a bushel of corn. There's no magic bean on your farm. So you only applied a pound per N, and Ferrie's saying it takes 1.6. Where did the rest of it come from? It comes from the soil. So it depends on where you live and how much your soil supplies, right, from that process. So when you're talking about efficiency, you can change your efficiency by your application, but at the same time, it's still going to take 1.6 pounds to grow the crop. It's not going to equal the removal. Okay? So when we think about that, 250 bushel corn, there's 100, if we take what's it take to grow it, 127 pounds of P2O5 or 275 pounds of DAP, 561 pounds of potash. Your potash uptake is very close to your N rate. Okay? 561 pounds of potash. That's what you got to have. So when you're thinking about, oh, I'm only going to put on removal, then you better make sure you have enough in the soil to hit what it takes for uptake within the plant. And if we think about 75 bushel beans, again, you're looking at 158 pounds of DAP and another 275 pounds of potash in the uptake side. Okay? So if we put that together and we think about a 250 bushel corn and a 75 bushel beans, and what I'm walking here today, that's going to be easy to get looking at this farm. So from the uptake side, you're going to have 434 pounds of DAP, 836 pounds of potash. Okay? That's what the uptake side is going to be. The removal is going to be less than that, but you got to have it there when you're thinking about where your soil values are. So we use soil tests, and the soil tests are steering this big ship. We're trying to predict whether we need to whack the pig this way or that way. And I know that sounds crude for something as high-end as science as labs and technology goes, but I'm telling you, it's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. But it's a good thing to work with. So I took a couple examples of some of our farms. We're testing by zone. We're testing on a 2-year cycle. In 2020, this farm was 41 parts per million phosphorus, 2.1% base saturation K. I want that K3 plus, and this is above the optimum range. So we do 2 years where we put on no DAP, and in this situation, but we put on 250 pounds of potash, 200 pounds the second year. Come back in 2022, we test this farm. Our phosphorus drops from 41 to 38, so it's going down, but it's still high. That's good. Our K goes up to 2.2, so we don't have to tap that pig over more. It's working right. We come back and now we put on 200 pounds of potash and no DAP. The next year, 150 pounds of potash and no DAP. We test it. Now my phosphate went back up to 42 parts per million, but my potash is up to 2.6. So my potash is going the right direction, but we went from 41 to 38 to 42, and we got 4 years we didn't put any phosphate on. Is that possible? Very possible, right? It's very possible, and the soil test will tell us when we need to tap the pig on the other side. So we think about that again. We have this huge supply of phosphorus that's cycling in your soil. Almost all of it is biologically held. Small percentage is held to the soil, but most of it's in a carbon chain, in a dead microbe, in a live microbe, in that crop. and certain amounts of it as it's cycling spin off that we can use, and we're trying to predict this much based on a soil test over here. We're not testing the whole pool. So in this case, for this farm, it would tell me that we don't need to put phosphate on again. By math, if I calculate the math, they should have moved more than that, but it didn't. Okay? The soil test keeps me balanced in that case. Here's another one where we had 28 parts per million phosphorus, 2% base saturation. So the first year, 250 pounds of potash, 200 of DAP. Come back on the bean year, another 200 pounds of potash. We test it in 22. The phosphate is 22 parts per million. We're holding our own. We come back and there were 200 of potash, 200 of DAP, 200 of potash on the second year. Come back and test it in 24. We're at 23 parts per million, 2.3. So maybe we need to tap the pig just a little bit, but we're moving in where we need or where we would predict it to go. And the soil test makes that difference. Where this farm, in 21, it's 41 parts per million, 323 parts per million potash. We didn't put any potash on, didn't put any DAP on, and come back in 2 years and sample it. The phosphate drops to 22, and the potash drops to almost 100 plus parts per million. What's the soil test telling us? We need to hit the pig, right? It moved it further than we anticipated in that case, or we're dropping it down. In mathematically, right, if I want to raise your phosphorus 1 part per million, it should take about 18 pounds of P2O5. If I want to raise your potash 1 part per million, it's going to take about 8 pounds in that situation. So for instance, if you were 7 parts per million, you're low on the soil test single digits, you want to raise that 18 parts per million, mathematically, that's going to be 324 pounds of P2O5 or 700 pounds of DAP. That's 700 pounds of DAP above your removal rate. Remember, because you got to keep ahead of that removal rate. So if you decide, okay, 120 pounds is my removal rate, and I'm going to add another, or 125, I'm going to add another 120 to it for 245 pounds of DAP, and I got to do that every year for 6 years to move that soil test back up in that optimum range. Okay, so that gets a little salty. Potash the same way as you're trying to fix that imbalance out there. So if we think about removal and what goes down the road, this time of year and margins are going to get tighter, right? And what happens when margins get tight, like they're about to the next 2 or 3 years, land opportunities are going to fall out of the rafters, right? Because cash rents are not going to be meeting the yields. What I get to deal with on my side is kind of frustrating sometimes. Young man's been trying to rent the farm. He can't get it. Then all of a sudden, he can get it because nobody else is bidding, okay? And he brings this farm to us. We soil sample it, and it's been sucked dry. Then the question is, where do you start? And situation where, let me find it here. If the farm's been sucked dry, there's going to be some challenges that you have to bring to it as far as, let me see here, how do I fix it? If the farm is acid, how do I get it neutralized? I'm going to do that with limestone. There's no way to put limestone on your farm without lowering your phosphorus, because limestone ties up to phosphorus. So as you're liming your field, you're going to see your phosphorus do this, okay, on a soil test. We try to stay away from 3 and 4 ton lime applications because they drive the phosphorus down too hard. So you try to balance that pH. So now you got an acid farm and you got a low testing farm, you're kind of caught. You can't cut cost, and you're trying to figure out how to keep that from being an amble around that new renter's neck. If there's no soil test to be found on a piece that you're trying to rent, now buying is different because you got a lifetime to fix it, but if you're trying to rent it and they just can't find any current soil test, that's a sign, right? And don't take farm management meaning that it's been managed. Some of the trashed farms that we deal with every fall come under decades of farm management. And I had more than one come in that last fall, and I called a farm manager that I personally know and said, hey, what's the deal? You've been managing this farm 15 years. How did it get in the gutter? He said, Ken, it don't make any difference. They'll pay the rent. He said, we're after the most money the landlord can get. It don't make any difference. And when we sell the farm, the soil tests don't make any difference. So a situation where he's probably right. You're not going to let that 160 go, but when it's 7 or 8 ton behind in limestone. And you think about limestone, as your farm gets in that 6.5 range, you're going to have 100% availability of the nutrients out there, or possibility of it. When it drops to a 5.5, you're going to lose $23 in your nitrogen application, 12 in your phosphorus, $5.50 in your potash. That's how inefficient it is, or how the numbers come down. So when we think about that, we need to lime it up, because it's the biology that does the work. If you have a well-balanced soil on 80 acres and a 6.5 pH, you would have, in bacteria alone, you would have the equivalent of 1,200 head of cattle, 1,000 pounds apiece, on 80 acres that are processing all this and bringing it back to you. You let your pH drop to a 5.4, you got 12 cows. That's how tough pH can be. There's a reason why some things that you look at say refrigerate after opening, right? You can leave ketchup out on the counter all week. Why? Why can you go in a restaurant and the ketchup bottle will be out all day? What's ketchup got that other things don't? Acidity, right? Good for fries, not good for the field. So from a biological standpoint, we have to think about that. Now, what I get is a lot of questions about, okay, I'm going to go to strip till. How much can I cut my fertilizer rate? Strip till, by banding your fertilizer, brings efficiency, but it doesn't change the math. So I can drive home today and I could keep it 45 to 50 miles per hour, no big gunning. I'm going to get a lot better mileage on my truck, but the tank is still going to run empty, right? So the situation we think about nutrient removal, it doesn't change the math. So stripping makes it more efficient, but it doesn't change that math. The other one I run into a lot, and right now we're running into it, biologicals. Okay, I'm going to add a biological. I'm going to put 2 quarts of this on and replace 400 pounds of fertilizer. And I'm telling you guys, 40 years in this business, that don't work. Okay? But if you're determined that you have the best biological package, and we think about biological, right? We sing bugs in a jug or bug food in a jug. If you have the right biological package that you're going to not put on any fertilizer, as long as the soil test dictates what you're doing is correct, I don't have a problem with it, right? But as the soil test is eroding, the problem with soil tests as they erode, it's like steering a pig, right? Once they actually start affecting yield, and people show up at our door looking for help, the build back is 5 or 6 years in the coming. You let a farm get acid, and you're 5 to 6 years from putting it back into a good biological scenario. So a guy who say, I'm interested, I'm going to put these biologicals on, but he hasn't done a soil test and hasn't put any lime on in 6 or 7 years, it's like spitting in the ocean and waiting for the level to change. Okay? And I don't sell either one, but working with one grower, a new grower came in and he said, man, my yields are in trouble. My bean yields are just slipping, my corn yields are so-so. So I took a soil test, we tested his farm, and it's in the gutter. And I said, what are you putting on for fertilizer? This is U of I, the U of I removal rates. Okay. I said, this didn't happen. You couldn't be putting removal rates on the last 15 years. Let me see your removal rates. Well, then to break it down, he takes the U of I removal rates, cuts them in half because he's stripping. Cuts them another 25% because he's using all liquid instead of dry. And somebody told him liquid's more efficient than dry, and that stripping you could cut your rates. Short term you can, but now he's in trouble. He's got single-digit numbers out there. And he saw our recommendations. He's still choking. He said, I think maybe I should go find an agronomist that better aligns with my thinking or my theologies. And I hate to say, I've seen hundreds of it. You probably should pay your bill, though, before you leave. But so as we go forward into these tighter margins and we're thinking about stepping on the brakes here or there, and P&K is one of the places, if you're at optimum levels, probably a pretty good chance that you can step on the brakes and pull back, and it won't affect your yields for very long. As long as you understand that somewhere down the road you're going to have to do what? You're going to have to refill it. You're going to have to refill it. You can't be going after 270 bushel corn in single-digit phosphates. So it's not a matter of, okay, I'm going to tap the brakes here, I hope things are going to follow, and then I'm going to put it back. And think about the soil test. Could you tap the brakes for a year or two, slow your inputs down, and the soil test say it didn't make any difference? That is possible. That's how this living organism we're trying to farm reacts. That's why we use the soil test to tell us when we're going to bounce these things back. We're going to hit that pig If you're going to focus on one thing, though, be very careful cutting your pH. Limestone tends to be the first one that gets thrown out, and it's the one that makes the biggest difference when we're looking at this farmer's yields and that farmer's yields. Think of limestone like P and K. Small amounts more often, not large amounts in that process. Any questions? I realize I'm going through a lot of math here, but.
What size zone are you soil sampling?
What size zone are we soil sampling? On average, for us, it's about 5 acres, but it could range from 2 to 7. What we do is we use the topography map, we use a LiDAR map for that topography, we use a soil type map, and then probably influenced heavy by the yield map. So you lay that yield map over, and you got a slope that's all one soil type, but somewhere in that slope that yield changes continuously. We'll break that into a zone. So more interested in sampling the field how it yields than I am how many acres I have within the sample.
Yesterday I took a tour of that precision planting farm in Illinois, and they had that radical agronomic soil testing machine. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The radical soil testing machine, and we've used it on our campus as well. Right now the process is to calibrate it. What do those numbers mean within it? So if that gets calibrated to indicate what we're doing, it's probably going to work, but it's the same old to some extent. So you can use a weak bray, strong bray, a Malick 2-3, you can use an Olson. There's all kinds of phosphorus extractions. I have a book in my office this thick, and it's all phosphorus extractions that you could use. Which one's right depends on the agronomist using it. Is he interpreting it right? What you run into is if you're trained on a number that I'm throwing up here, and you take 25 parts per million and take it to a different lab, 25 parts per million. For instance, if it tested 25 parts per million in a weak bray, in a Malick, which should be and Malick extraction, it's going to probably be about 35 or 40. And you can't; those are not on the same page. So they're using mainly Malick for that extraction. So they have to come up with what that calibration is. If you're along the East Coast, they're going to use other sampling that can handle acidic soil. So the numbers in those acidic soils are going to be lower. So you sometimes find some of the livestock operations in the Midwest, they're using an eastern sample because it keeps their phosphate level down on their soil test. I didn't say that. But the situation where how you use the sample is going to be part of it. I think they got a lot of calibrating to do, and once the calibration is done, then it's going to be another stick to beat the pig with.
Which test do you use?
So we use a weak bray, strong bray for phosphorus. We use ammonium acetate for the cations out here. We're calculating a CEC, which is you can actually run a cation exchange or you can calculate it. So they're going to be different. We'll use a calculated CEC to come up with our number. We use a hybrid between the Walkley Black method and loss on ignition for organic matter. So it's kind of somewhere in between with the numbers. But organic matter is pretty stable in the soil. And if you go to a no-till cover crop meeting, if somebody gets up and says, I doubled my organic matter in 4 years, he just changed labs. You can't do that, right? Situation where it moves, but it doesn't move in that level. But literally you could use a color extraction and a loss on ignition extraction on the same field and have a 2 and a 4% organic matter. You'd have that kind of potential difference.